been putting your money to work for 75 years, building a more prosperous Miami. Count on us being here tomorrow.
Oh, yeah. That's because for 75 years you've been fucking everybody. Somebody should do something about this horse. Right? Charging me 10 points on my money. But they're getting away with it. Fuck. There's no loss anymore.
Forget it, man.
I mean, anything goes.
They've been around 1,000 years, okay? They got all the angles figured out.
You know what capitalism is? Getting fucked.
True capitalist if ever I met one.
What you gonna do? Damn. Niggas wanna stick me for my paper. Damn. Niggas wanna stick me for my paper. Damn. Niggas wanna stick me for my paper. Damn. Niggas wanna stick me for my paper.
Interestingly, McGeer claimed that Lincoln was assassinated not only because international bankers wanted to reestablish a central bank in America, but because they also wanted to base America's currency on gold. Gold they controlled. In other words, put America on a gold standard. Lincoln had done just the opposite by issuing U.S. notes, greenbacks, which were based purely on the good faith and credit of the United States. The article quoted McGeer as saying,
"They were the men interested in the establishment of the gold standard and the right of the bankers to manage the currency and credit of every nation in the world. With Lincoln out of the way, they were able to proceed with that plan and did proceed with it in the United States. Within 8 years after Lincoln's assassination, silver was demonetized and the gold standard money system set up in the United States."
Not since Lincoln has the U.S. issued debt-free United States notes. These red-sealed bills, which were issued in 1963, were not a new issue from President Kennedy, but merely the old greenbacks reissued year after year. In another act of folly and ignorance, the 1994 Regal Act actually authorized the replacement of Lincoln's greenbacks with debt-based notes. In other words, greenbacks were in circulation in the United States until 1994. Why was silver bad for the bankers and gold good? Simple. Because silver was plentiful in the United States. It was very hard to control. Gold was, and always has been, scarce. Throughout history, it has been relatively easy to monopolize gold, but silver has historically been 15 times more plentiful. With Lincoln out of the way, the money changers' next objective was to gain complete control over America's money. This was no easy task. With the opening of the American West, silver had been discovered in huge quantities. On top of that, Lincoln's greenbacks were generally popular. Despite the European central bankers' deliberate attacks on greenbacks, they continued to circulate in the United States, in fact, until a few years ago. According to historian W. Cleon Skousen,
right after the Civil War, there was considerable talk about reviving Lincoln's brief experiment with the constitutional monetary system. Had not the European Money Trust intervened, it would have no doubt become an established institution.
It is clear that the concept of America printing her own debt-free money sent shockwaves throughout the European central banking elite. They watched with horror as Americans clamored for more greenbacks. They may have killed Lincoln, but support for his monetary ideas grew. On April 12, 1866, nearly 1 year to the day of Lincoln's assassination, Congress went to work at the bidding of the European central banking interests. It passed the Contraction Act, authorizing the Secretary of the Treasury to begin to retire some of the greenbacks in circulation and thereby contract the money supply. Authors Theodore R. Thorin and Richard F. Warner explained the results of the money contraction in their classic book on the subject, The Truth in Money Book.
The hard times which occurred after the Civil War could have been avoided if the greenback legislation had continued as President Lincoln had intended. Instead, there were a series of money panics, what we call recessions, which put pressure on Congress to enact legislation to place the banking system under centralized control. Eventually, the Federal Reserve Act was passed on December 23, 1913.
In other words, the money changers wanted two things: the reinstitution of a central bank under their exclusive control, and two, an American currency backed by gold. Their strategy was twofold. First of all, cause a series of panics to try to convince the American people that only centralized control of the money supply could provide economic stability. And secondly, remove so much money from the system that most Americans would be so desperately poor that they either wouldn't care or would be too weak to oppose the bankers. In 1866, there was $1.8 billion in currency in circulation in the United States, about $50.46 per capita. In 1867 alone, $500 million, $500 million, was removed from the U.S. money supply. 10 years later, in 1876, America's money supply was reduced to only $600 million. In other words, 2/3 of America's money had been called in by the bankers. Only $14.60 per capita remained in circulation. 10 years later, the money supply had been reduced to only $400 million, even though the population had boomed. The result was that only $6.67 per capita remained in circulation, a 760% loss in buying power over 20 years. Today, economists try to sell the idea that recessions and depressions are a natural part of something they call the business cycle. The truth is, our money supply is manipulated now just as it was before and after the Civil War. How did this happen? How did money become so scarce? Simple. Bank loans were called in and no new ones were given. In addition, silver coins were melted down. In 1872, a man named Ernest Sed was given 100,000 pounds, about $500,000, by the Bank of England and sent to America to bribe necessary congressmen to get silver demonetized. He was told that if that was not sufficient, to draw an additional 100,000 pounds or as much more as was necessary. The next year, Congress passed the Coinage Act of 1873, and the minting of silver dollars abruptly stopped. In fact, Representative Samuel Hooper, who introduced the bill in the House, acknowledged that Mr. Sed actually drafted the legislation. But it gets even worse than that. In 1874, Sed himself admitted who was behind the scheme.
I went to America in the winter of 1872-73, authorized to secure, if I could, the passage of a bill demonetizing silver. It was in the interest of those I represented, the governors of the Bank of England, to have it done. By 1873, gold coins were the only form of coin money.
But the contest over control of America's money was not yet over. Only 3 years later, in 1876, with 1/3 of America's workforce unemployed, the population was growing restless. People were clamoring for a return to the greenback money system of President Lincoln or a return to silver money, anything that would make money more plentiful. That year, Congress created the United States Silver Commission to study the problem. Their report clearly blamed the monetary contraction on the national bankers. The report is interesting because it compares the deliberate money contraction by the national bankers after the Civil War to the fall of the Roman Empire.
The disaster of the Dark Ages was caused by decreasing money and falling prices. Without money, civilization could not have had a beginning, and with a diminishing supply, it must languish, and unless relieved, finally perish. At the Christian era, the metallic money of the Roman Empire amounted to $1,800,000,000. By the end of the 15th century, it had shrunk to less than $200 million. History records no other such disastrous transition as that from the Roman Empire to the Dark Ages. Despite
this report by the Silver Commission, Congress took no action. The next year, 1877, riots broke out from Pittsburgh to Chicago. The torches of starving vandals lit up the sky. The bankers huddled to decide what to do. They decided to hang on. Now that they were back in control to a certain extent, they were not about to give it up. At the meeting of the American Bankers Association that year, they urged their membership to do everything in their power to put down the notion of a return to greenbacks. The ABA Secretary, James Buell, authored a letter to the members which blatantly called on the banks to subvert not only Congress, but the press.
It is advisable to do all in your power to sustain such prominent daily and weekly newspapers, especially the agricultural and religious press, as will oppose the greenback issue of paper money, and that you will also withhold patronage from all applicants who are not willing to oppose the government issue of money. To repeal the act creating banknotes or to restore to circulation the government issue of money will be to provide the people with money and will therefore seriously affect our individual profits as bankers and lenders. See your congressman at once and engage him to support our interest that we may control legislation.
As political pressure mounted in Congress for change, the press tried to turn the American people away from the truth. The New York Tribune put it this way on January 10th, 1878. "The capital of the country is organized at last, and we will see whether Congress will dare to fly in its face." But it didn't work entirely. On February 28, 1878, Congress passed the Sherman Law, allowing the minting of a limited number of silver dollars, ending the 5-year hiatus. This did not end gold backing of the currency, however, nor did it completely free silver. Previous to 1873, anyone who brought silver to the U.S. Mint could have it struck into silver dollars free of charge. No longer. But at least some money began to flow back into the economy again. With no further threat to their control, the bankers loosened up on loans, and the post-Civil War depression was finally ended.
3 years later, the American people elected Republican James Garfield president. Garfield understood how the economy was being manipulated. As a congressman, he had been chairman of the Appropriations Committee and was a member of Banking and Currency. After his inauguration, he slammed the money changers publicly in 1881. Whoever controls the volume of money in any country is absolute master of all industry and commerce. And when you realize that the entire system is very easily controlled, one way or another, by a few powerful men at the top, you will not have to be told how periods of inflation and depression originate.
Unfortunately, within a few weeks of making this statement, on July 2nd of 1881, President Garfield was assassinated. The money changers were gathering strength fast. They began a periodic fleecing of the flock, as they called it, by creating economic booms followed by further depressions so they could buy up thousands of homes and farms for pennies on the dollar. In 1891, the money changers prepared to take the American economy down again, and their methods and motives were laid out with shocking clarity in a memo sent out by the American Bankers Association, the ABA, an organization in which most bankers were members. Notice that this memo called for bankers to create a depression on a certain date 3 years in the future. According to the congressional record, here's how it read in part.
On September 1st, 1894, we will not renew our loans under any consideration. On September 1st, we will demand our money. We will foreclose and become mortgagees in possession. We can take 2/3 of the farms west of the Mississippi and thousands of them east of the Mississippi as well at our price. Then the farmers will become tenants, as in England.
These depressions could be controlled because America was on the gold money standard. Since gold is scarce, it's one of the easiest commodities to manipulate.
People wanted silver money legalized again so they could escape the stranglehold the money changers had on gold money. People wanted silver money reinstated, reversing Mr. Said's Act of 1873, by then called the Crime of '73. By 1896, the issue of more silver money had become the central issue in the presidential campaign. William Jennings Bryan, a senator from Nebraska, ran for president as a Democrat on the free silver issue. At the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, he made an emotional speech which won him the nomination entitled Crown of Thorns and Cross of Gold. Though Bryan was only 36 years old at the time, this speech is widely regarded as the most famous oration ever made before a political convention. In the dramatic conclusion, Bryan said,
"We will answer their demand for a gold standard by saying to them, you shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold."
The bankers lavishly supported the Republican candidate, William McKinley, who favored the gold standard. The resulting contest was amongst the most fiercely contested presidential races in American history. Bryan made over 600 speeches in 27 states. The McKinley campaign got manufacturers and industrialists to inform their employees that if Bryan were elected, all factories and plants would close and there would be no work. The ruse succeeded. McKinley beat Bryan by a small margin. Bryan ran for president again in 1900 and in 1908, but fell short each time. During the 1912 Democratic Convention, Bryan was a powerful figure who helped Woodrow Wilson win the nomination. When Wilson became president, he appointed Bryan as Secretary of State, but Bryan soon became disenchanted with the Wilson administration. Bryan served only 2 years in the Wilson administration before resigning in 1915 over the highly suspicious sinking of the Lusitania, the event which was used to drive America into World War I. Although William Jennings Bryan never gained the presidency, his efforts delayed the money changers for 17 years from attaining their next goal, a new, privately owned central bank for America.
This has been the big story of the Keiser Report for the past 3 or 4 years. And the FT front page of the Financial Times reads, Germany to shift 54,000 gold bars home, one of the biggest shipments of yellow metal on record. Which inspired this front page on the Financial Times was this announcement on the Deutsche Bundesbank website. Deutsche Bundesbank's new storage plan for Germany's gold reserves. By 2020, the Bundesbank intends to store half of Germany's gold reserves in its own vaults in Germany. The other half will remain in storage at its partner central banks in New York and London.
Well, Germany has no partner central banks. This is every man for himself, and those with the most gold are going to win the currency war, as we've been warning about now for years. This is why the euro has been trading relatively well against the dollar, because in the eurozone there are 12,000, 13,000 tons of gold versus the U.S., which has maybe 8,000 tons. But one of the big problems, Stacey, of course, is the central banks have leased their gold out and sold it, and it's now sitting in the pockets of hundreds of millions of Indians on the continent of India. And so when Germany goes to collect their gold, they find that it's not there. It's been sold. And that's what this war is all about, especially now that the central banking system is collapsing and countries want the only currency without counterparty risk, the only currency you can't print more of, and that would be gold.
Now, they mentioned their partner central banks. Now, this is a remnant of the Bretton Woods system. So post-World War II, the U.S. dollar was declared the world's reserve currency, but for international trade, it was backed by gold. And because you were having to settle your balance of trade via the central banks, it was convenient in 1945 and 1950 and 1960 for Germany to store gold in New York at the New York Fed, because if they had a trade imbalance with America, they would just settle it there through the bank or settle it with the UK via the bank. But now, since 1971, it's really been, there's no point for them to really store so much gold in these central banks. So now they say, to this end, now that they have all this storage They say it's just a storage plan, remember. The Bundesbank is planning a phased relocation of 300 tons of gold from New York to Frankfurt, as well as an additional 374 tons from Paris to Frankfurt by 2020. This means they're taking their percentage of their gold held in France to 0, and they're reducing their holdings in New York by 20%, because right now they have 1,500 tons there. So over the next 7 years, they're going to bring 40 tons a year back.
Now, since 2009, central banks have been buying gold, reversing a 40-year trend. And I would expect Germany now not only to be repatriating gold, but to be actively buying gold, just like Russia is actively buying gold. China is actively buying gold. Germany will be actively buying gold as well, and as it becomes known that this gold is not where it's supposed to be, expect panic buying of gold. That's how we get to $10,000 an ounce on gold and $500 an ounce on silver.
Now, this is a huge political statement as well to ask for your gold back in light of the fact that all our international trade, all our international currencies are based on fiat and faith in that system. So the fact that Germany is asking for so much gold, as the Financial Times says, the largest ever movement of gold in world history. And then, so the Financial Times gives a hint of the reason why Germany would make such a grand request. Bundesbank weighs bullion against public pressure. So I want to look back and how did this public pressure come about? And indeed, I could tell you why it came about. Here is the man Nostradamus warned you about, the one that would cause World War III.
Maxadamus! Maxadamus! That this is World War III. It's a currency war. We've been calling this for 10 years. Really, since we started doing our podcast 10 years ago, we said this is what this century is going to be defined as the currency war. Buy gold and silver. Gold was $250 an ounce at that time. Now it's $1,600, $1,700 an ounce. And we've taken our audience with us as the most outstanding performing asset for the decade.
So let's roll back to how Max caused this. In case you are not aware of this, there's a film called Brown's Bottom. And in it, we made this in 2008. And on March 17th, 2008, that was a Monday, Max and I had an appointment with the Bundesbank, with the head of their gold department. And what happened on Sunday, the 16th of March 2008, was Ben Bernanke had slashed interest rates by 75 basis points. Unprecedented move to slash interest rates so much and on a Sunday. And the reason he did this was because of the collapse of Bear Stearns. Also, gold had just hit the $1,000 mark, the first time ever. So here Max had an appointment with the Bundesbank, head of the gold department, and the reason for it was we were investigating Brown's Bottom, why he sold their gold at historic lows. We wanted to find out why the Bundesbank kept their gold in order to understand the psychology of Gordon Brown. Lo and behold, there was panic, there was chaos, and let's turn to the very last clip of that film of what happened when Max went into the Bundesbank. He was not allowed to speak to the head of gold, but he did speak to another executive inside the building.
The fear is that the banking system itself is in peril.
That is the question, yeah. That's the question. It's in America, it's in Germany, you know.
Right. But you don't know.
Actually, now you don't know what's going on. No? Up to now, I mean, you don't really know what's coming, no? What's coming.
The most fascinating thing I learned is that all the gold in Germany is in New York. Now, since that film was made, Stacy, central banks around the world have been buying gold. They have also been printing money. The amount of money that central banks have been printing since that film came out is up 400%. Many, many trillions of fiat dollars, yen, and euros have been created. The total supply of gold around the world during the same period of time is up a whopping 8%.
And now we have a situation where they're asking for their gold back.
Here's a number that will be one of the defining numbers of 2013, grams per capita. This is the division of total gold held by a country divided by its population. Number one in the world is Switzerland with about 126 grams per capita. America's got about 25 grams per capita, but that's, of course, assuming that the gold is in Fort Knox, which a lot of people argue it's not. And Germany and the rest of Europe and people around the world want to boost their grams per capita number as we enter this currency war, which you can look at it this way, Stacey. We've gone from the Cold War to the Gold War.
Yes. And now, is this Gold War going to go down so you know, easily in the United States, because of course this is really a shot across the bow of the U.S. dollar reserve standard. So let's look at what the largest bond fund manager in the world says about this. This is also on the front page of the Financial Times. Mohammed El-Arian, Germany's gold move. He says, quote, "This unusual and highly visible decision is sure to trigger an explosion of media commentary relating both to motivation and implications, especially since Germany joins Iran, Libya, and Venezuela in making such a move." Now, Max, we all know what happened to Libya. We all know what is happening to Iran and Venezuela. This is a remarkable threat, essentially.
According to some, it's about protecting civilians.
And our resolve is clear. The people of Libya must be protected.
Others say it's about oil.
The only reason they're interested with Libya is about the oil. You'd think we'd be in Iraq if the major export there was broccoli.
But some are convinced intervention in Libya is all about currency, specifically Gaddafi's plan to introduce the gold dinar, a single African currency made from gold, a true sharing of the wealth.
It's one of these things that you have to plan almost in secret, because as soon as you say you're going to change over from the dollar to something else, you're going to be targeted. There were two conferences on this, one in '96 and another one in the year 2000, called the World Mataba Conference, organized by Gaddafi. And everybody was interested. I think most countries in Africa were keen.
Gaddafi didn't give up. In the months leading up to the military intervention, he called on African and Muslim nations to join together to create this new currency that would rival the dollar and euro. They would sell oil and other resources around the world only for gold dinars. It's an idea that would shift the economic balance of the world. Countries' wealth would depend on how much gold they have, not how many dollars they trade. And Libya has 144 tons of gold. The UK has double that, but 10 times the population.
If Gaddafi had an intent to try to reprice his oil or whatever else the country was selling in the global markets and accept something else as a currency, or maybe launch a gold dinar currency, any move such as that would certainly not be welcomed by the power elite today who are responsible for controlling the world's central banks. So yes, that would certainly be something that would cause his immediate dismissal and the need for other reasons to be brought forth for removing him from power.
It's happened before. In 2000, Saddam Hussein announced Iraqi oil would be traded in euros, not dollars. Sanctions and an invasion followed. Some say because the Americans were desperate to prevent OPEC from transferring oil trading in all its member countries to the euro. A gold dinar would have had serious consequences for the world financial system, but may also have empowered the people of Africa, something black activists say the US wants to avoid at all costs.
The United States should welcome the self-determination of Africans. They certainly have denied self-determination to Africans inside the United States, so we're not surprised by anything that the United States would do to hinder self-determination of Africans on the continent.
The UK's gold is kept here in a secure vault somewhere in the depths of the Bank of England. As in most developed countries, there's not enough to go around. But that's not the case in places like Libya and many of the Gulf states. A gold dinar would have given oil-rich African and Middle Eastern countries the power to turn around to their energy-hungry customers and say, sorry, the price has gone up and we want gold. Some say the US and its NATO allies literally couldn't afford to let that happen.
Oh, that's the American business model. That's the Washington consensus, isn't it? We don't want to compete. We'll just frickin' kill you. Think L-Ron, L-Pimpco, pimp, bond, pimp. You know, who needs that? Who needs that? What about capitalism? What about competition, Pimco? Don't kill your competitors, you frickin' cowardly moron.
Yes, but listen, they are living in a world, in a matrix in which they are the bond kings. Here, they've actually been advising clients, and Bill Gross has been quite vocal that he himself is buying gold for his own portfolio. But that's within the context of a fiat currency global system in which the US dollar is king. When Germany does this, however, it's not just a simple investor protecting their wealth. This is a political statement. This is an act of war. They see that it makes their whole paradigm of investment change.
You see, in periods of economic upheaval, in economic crisis, wealth is not destroyed. It is merely transferred.
Well, I want to get focused on this German repatriation of gold for a second. I'm looking at the comments from Mohammed El-Iran, who's the co-head of PIMCO, biggest bond buyer owner in the U.S. He wrote an opinion piece in the FT, and he likens this act by Germany as similar to the behavior of Libya, Iran, Venezuela. Now, how likely is that we're going to see a serious repercussions against Germany? In other words, Doug, you have a private investor who is stepping into the fray here and virtually threatening Germany with Libya-like actions for simply wanting their gold back. There's a couple of moving parts here. What do you see, Doug Casey?
I really don't know what's on the minds of the Germans, except it impresses me as a very intelligent thing for them to do. And I'm sure they're sorry if the Americans and the French don't like it, but they have to act in their own best interests. And it's certainly in their own best interest to have their gold repatriated to the place where it belongs. And as far as whether we're going to have any wars in the future, I don't think there's any question about that, because as the going gets tough within countries, governments always like to redirect the problem to somebody else, some nasty foreigners that are hurting us. And some of these people actually think that war is good for the economy. So yes, I'm sure we're going to see more of that type of thing. And maybe not just little sport wars like in Afghanistan and what was in Iraq, real wars where the U.S. goes to hunt big game, which is going to be very, very dangerous.
The Third World War has already started. It is a silent war, not for that reason any less sinister. The war is tearing down Brazil, Latin America, and practically all the Third World. Instead of soldiers dying, there are children. It is a war over the Third World debt, one which has as its main weapon interest, a weapon more deadly than the atom bomb, more shattering.
As the worldwide depression worsens and spreads, this will give the World Central Bank the power of economic life and death over these nations. It will decide which nations will be permitted to receive further loans and which nations will starve. Despite all the rhetoric about development and the alleviation of poverty, the result is a steady transfer of wealth from the debtor nations to the money changers' central banks, which control the IMF and the World Bank. For example, in 1992, the Third World debtor nations, which borrowed from the World Bank, paid $198 million more to the central banks of the developed nations for World Bank-funded purposes than they received from the World Bank. All this increases their permanent debt in exchange for temporary relief of poverty caused by prior borrowings. Already, these repayments exceed the amount of the new loans. By 1992, Africa's external debt had reached $290 billion, 2.5 times greater than in 1980, resulting in skyrocketing infant mortality rates and unemployment, deterioration of schools, housing, and the general health of the people.
The entire world faces the immeasurable suffering already destroying the Third World and now Japan, all for the benefit of the money changers. The fact is that the Fed is specifically designed to operate independently of our government, as are nearly all other central banks. Some argue that the Fed promotes monetary stability. We saw the current head of the Bank of England, Eddie George, claim that this was the most important role of a central bank. In fact, the Fed's record of stabilizing the economy shows it to be a miserable failure in this regard. Within the first 25 years of its existence, the Fed caused 3 major economic downturns, including the Great Depression, and for the last 30 years has shepherded the American economy into a period of unprecedented inflation. Again, this is not some wild conspiracy theory. It's a well-known fact among top economists. As Nobel Prize-winning economist Milton Friedman put it, "The stock of money prices, and output was decidedly more unstable after the establishment of the Federal Reserve System than before. The most dramatic period of instability in output was, of course, the period between the two wars, which includes the severe monetary contractions of 1920-21, 1929-33, and 1937-38. No other 20-year period in American history contains as many as 3 such severe contractions. This evidence persuades me that at least a third of the price rise during and just after World War I is attributable to the establishment of the Federal Reserve System, and that the severity of each of the major contractions, 1920-21, 1929-33, and 1937-38, is directly attributable to acts of commission and omission by the reserve authorities. Any system which gives so much power and so much discretion to a few men so that mistakes, excusable or not, can have such far-reaching effects is a bad system. It is a bad system to believers in freedom just because it gives a few men such power without any effective check by the body politic. This is the key political argument against an independent central bank. To paraphrase Clemenceau, money is much too serious a matter to be left to the central bankers. Today, they profit from either side of the new political spectrum. The big government welfare state on the so-called left wing versus the neoconservative laissez-faire capitalists who want big government totally out of their lives on the right wing. Either way, the bankers win. Monetary reform is the most important political issue facing this nation. That clarified, let's proceed to the conclusions in the spirit Lincoln declared, with malice towards none, with charity towards all. Do we have any hints as to what the money changers have in store for us? Here's what David Rockefeller, the chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank, the largest Wall Street bank, had to say. We are on the verge of a global transformation. All we need is the right major crisis and the nation will accept the New World Order. So, crisis is needed to fulfill their plans quickly. The only question is when the crisis will occur. Fortunately, we probably have a little time. It's unlikely that this crisis will occur before the 1996 elections, but after that, the danger begins rising. But whether or not they decide to cause a crash or a depression through relentless increases in taxes and the loss of hundreds of thousands of jobs being sent overseas thanks to trade agreements such as GATT and NAFTA, the American middle class is an endangered species. Cheaper labor, including slave labor in Red China, which Harry Wu has heroically documented, is being used to compete with American labor. In other words, money is being consolidated in fewer and fewer hands as never before in the history of this nation or the world. Without reform, the American middle class will soon be extinct, leaving only the very rich few and the very many poor, as has already occurred in most of the world. We've been warned of all this by congressmen, presidents, industrialists, and economists down through the years. Religious leaders, too, have seen the danger. About 1898, during the time of William Jennings Bryan, Pope Leo XIII put it this way. On the one side, there is the party which holds the power because it holds the wealth, which has in its grasp all labor and all trade, which manipulates for its own benefit and its own purposes all the sources of supply, and which is powerfully represented in the councils of state itself. On the other side, there is the needy and powerless multitude, sore and suffering. Rapacious usury, which, although more than once condemned by the Church, is nevertheless under a different form, but with the same guilt, still practiced by avaricious and grasping men, so that a small number of very rich men have been able to lay upon the masses of the poor a yoke little better than slavery itself. More recently, during America's Great Depression, Pope Pius XI spoke of the same problem. In our days, not alone is wealth accumulated, but immense power and despotic economic domination is concentrated in the hands of a few. This power becomes particularly irresistible when exercised by those who, because they hold and control money, are able also to govern credit and determine its allotment. For this reason, supplying, so to speak, the lifeblood to the entire economic body and grasping, as it were, in their hands the very soul of the economy, so that no one dare breathe against their will.
It's not personal, Sonny. It's strictly business.